Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We've got a lot to cover today. Chelsey Youman in with us again with First Liberty. And I guess we'll start off with the lead story, where we're going to get into all sorts of topics today, and certainly do welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. But kind of the story that a lot of people are focusing on is the decision to indict Paul Manafort. This is something I think a lot of people have been expecting for some time, if for no other reason than questions about his involvement in Ukraine. He originally emerged as kind of a key figure in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's inquiry, but this really has very little, if anything, to do with whether or not there was collusion. And that is what the special counsel is supposed to be focusing on. Doesn't mean that this is not important. Here's an individual that actually accepted the position of campaign chairman back in about March. Really spent a fair amount of his time organizing what ended up being the Republican convention and some of the speaking and those kinds of things, and then simply stepped down in August after that was over. But back in August, was already saying some things that would certainly get people's attention. Chelsey, as I sometimes say, didn't pass the straight face test. For example, he had public denials of corruption and said things like, "I've never received a single off-the-books cash payment as falsely reported by the New York Times, nor have I ever done work for the governments of Ukraine or Russia." That's one of those technically true but very misleading, because he had worked for the pro-Russian political party in Ukraine. There have been a number of stories of the fact that when the Ukrainian governments actually found people working in sort of off-the-books kinds of areas, Paul Manafort's name shows up time and time again. So, you know, we'll find out where this goes, but if nothing else, that's kind of the lead story here today on Point of View.
There is just a wild, wild web to be following with all of these, the collusion investigations. There's so many investigations, it's hard to keep track of all of them.
Yeah. And especially the focus today will be on this instead of the focus that wasn't even in the press yesterday. You know, you have the talking head shows. You'd think somebody would have mentioned something we talked about with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter and ourselves on Friday, and that is, well, wait a minute, there's all this evidence, and we can get into that in just a minute, but when the Washington Post says Clinton campaign and the DNC paid for Russia dossier, and when you have the Uranium One scandal, you'd think that would get covered. But again, the mainstream media has done a good job of focusing on everything but what we think are one of the more important stories.
That's right. I think I read somewhere that 93% of the coverage right now is Trump, and it's negative. And so rather than actually seeing the story where Russia did try to influence our election, but maybe it wasn't with the Trump campaign, maybe it was with the DNC and Hillary, I would hope that would get some traction. So I hope people are paying attention and go to the Washington Post article and read about that too.
One of the things I always encourage you to do, especially here at Point of View, is to have some discernment, because in this particular story, we're going to hear nothing but Paul Manafort as well as his associate, Gates. Forget his first name off the top of my head, but that is an individual, Rick Gates, who has also been involved. And again, he stepped away back in August of last year because of questions about his foreign ties. Now, the Ukraine National Anti-Corruption Bureau did scans of all sorts of entries into the ledgers of what were called these black accounts, and they listed Paul Manafort's name a number of times, leading to payments totaling $12.7 million for work tied to the pro-Russian Ukrainian president. And so that was first reported in the New York Times. So when he comes back and says, well, that's not exactly true because I did not work for the government. Well, maybe not, but you really did. And so I don't know how to sort this out, but I think what you have are those who are going to defend Donald Trump today are going to say, well, maybe he misspoke when he gave his testimony. And so they'll say this is maybe like Scooter Libby. You go back a couple of years, and this was something that happened under the Bush administration and the revealing of Valerie Plame Wilson, who actually supposedly was unveiled as a CIA operative when most people knew it anyway. But okay, he did not in one testimony say the same thing he did in another one. And as a lawyer sitting across the table, you know, that can get you in trouble in depositions. So some will say, well, Paul Manafort misspoke. On the other hand, you're going to have some that are going to be anti-Trump saying this is evidence now of collusion. And no, it isn't. It's somewhere in between. Maybe indeed we have tax fraud. Maybe we have a number of issues that the FBI should be looking at. But because the special counsel is looking at this, I suspect over the next couple of days we're going to hear that this is just more evidence of the fact that Donald Trump and the campaign were tied to the Russian government.
Right. I think it looks like completely separate set of facts. It looks like personal fraud or corporate fraud issues, which is really, really a completely different thing than colluding with the Russians. So hopefully there will be some separation there. I doubt there will be in the coverage, but I think everyone's starting to look around and say this ongoing investigation sure is taking a lot of time, and we still don't have a smoking gun, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's another part of that issue that I thought I would raise for just a minute before we take a break. Number one, just take everything you're going to hear over the next 24, 48 hours with a grain of salt, including some of the things maybe even we say around here, but especially recognize that you're going to get one extreme, oh, he just misspoke, to, no, this is evidence of collusion. I think it's somewhere in between where probably tax fraud is a problem that is going to face Paul Manafort. But the other issue to pay attention to is that we knew from the beginning Robert Mueller could not have no indictment, or if you don't like the double negatives, you had to have an indictment. He had to have something so that all the time, energy, and resources, and especially the money that is involved in all this wasn't going to waste. So I knew somebody was going to be indicted. Almost all of us had the odds-on possibility it was Paul Manafort, so now we have that. But maybe we can move on to something else, don't you think?
Well, I would hope so, but it's a far cry to say it didn't go to waste because they're still searching. They're still searching out there, and hopefully this narrative will end soon. I think everyone's a little bit tired and weary of it. The narrative I want to start, though, is the Clinton narrative and the DNC narrative. Funding, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the segment, I know, but just all of the actual money and exchange of hands that we do have hard facts on. I think that's definitely worth the public knowing.
Yeah, I think so, too. We need to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about that for just a minute. Then I want to get into some other issues. Chelsey and certainly First Liberty have been spending some time kind of looking at the slow walk of judicial nominees. Now we have the possibility that 6 judicial nominees actually will push forward, and we'll talk about some of those individuals, so we'll get into that. I do need to at least mention something about all the Houston players that took a knee, not because of Black Lives Matter, but because of what the owner had to say. And we'll get into the whole issue of sexual freedom and respect for women. Which do we really want? Rob Schultzwalter's been on the program with us before, uses that as a good illustration. Some of the conversation we had last week with Nick and Chelsey on that regard. And then I thought we might get into Wikipedia, or as Robert Knight says, Wackopedia. And first of all, again, just another area of discernment. When you read it in Wikipedia, it may not necessarily be the case. And so Robert Knight at the American Civil Rights Union has had some problems with the fact that people have changed some of the entries. I know First Liberty's had a little bit of a problem with that, too. So we'll talk about some of those issues and get into some very important topics. If you'd like to join us at any point, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Point of View, we'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The plight of persecuted Christians is worse than ever. That is the conclusion of a recent report by Aid to the Church in Need. It documents that persecution of Christians today is worse than at any time in history. Not only are Christians more persecuted than any other faith groups, but ever-increasing numbers are experiencing the very worst forms of persecution. In some countries, the situation is already severe, so it's hard to imagine how it could be any worse. Other countries, like China, have seen intolerance on the rise, as evidenced by a clampdown on dissident clergy and the destruction of churches. In light of this, I was deeply convicted by my recent interview with Johnny Moore. He came on Point of View to talk about his book, The Martyr's Oath. He begins the book, and we began our interview by talking about attending a Bible school graduation ceremony. The students repeated this martyr's oath in which they pledged their lives and death to Jesus. He felt like he was standing in the book of Acts, witnessing a raw first-century Christianity that had been shielded from him in America. It says things like, "As he has given his life for me, so I'm willing to give my life for him. I will use every breath I possess to boldly proclaim his gospel." It later goes on to say, "Though persecution may come, I know my battle is not against flesh, but against the forces of evil. I will not hate those whom God has called me to love. Therefore I will forgive when ridiculed, show mercy when struck, and love when hated." Johnny Moore often asks himself, why are so few of us in America willing to live for Jesus when others are so willing to die for him? It's a good question all of us should ask ourselves. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take on these scandals, if you will, that have been around for some time. The first one is what's called Uranium One. If you remember, if you have ever listened to Point of View in the past, and for those of you that maybe have, we've had Peter Schweitzer on many times and had published a book over a year ago called Clinton Cash. And there he documented something which then finally began to make the mainstream press. Chelsey, one of the things I find is that sometimes things get covered, but until it's in The Hill or until it's in the Washington Post, it's not real. Now, The Hill, for those people that are not familiar, is kind of the journal of record for the Congress. And so Peter Schweitzer had written about this. It was a best-selling book, but nobody really took it as seriously until you have John Solomon writing this article in The Hill, pointing out that the Obama administration, in a very controversial deal back in 2010, which basically sent a large swath of uranium from the United States, like 20%, to Russia. This happened at a time when they were aware, that is, the people making the decision, which included Eric Holder and then, of course, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that the Russian nuclear industry had been engaged in bribery, kickbacks, extortion, and money laundering. And so this particular story was getting a lot of attention a year ago. It got a lot more attention now because in addition to that decision being made that even while all of this was taking place, more than $100 million went into the Clinton Foundation. it, again, back to my favorite line, doesn't pass the straight face test to say that the two incidents were unrelated, right?
Well, my first thought is that's some cheap uranium. 190 million for 20% of our country. That's a low price to be bought by, but I think that there's nothing that surprises me anymore about the deep-rooted corruption, not only in the Democratic Party, but in the Clinton family. What surprises me is that it's been going on for so long. I mean, they've made a career out of this corruption, and that it's just now getting coverage. How many years later? 7 years later after the transaction.
That's true.
This is something that should not only grieve the American people, but alarm the American people that Russia, who I think we all saw make moves after that into the Ukraine and into their bordering countries. Russia's really started over militarizing. They're now involved in our elections. I think it's no wonder that Putin, frankly, disrespected Obama and his administration and did things military-wise under that administration that he never did under the Bush administration, and hopefully not under the Trump administration.
Well, and again, one of the other things, you talked about all the millions that went into the coffers of the Clinton Family Foundation, but also how about $500,000 for one speech in Russia that was paid by a bank to Bill Clinton? And again, just all of that corruption that was there is one of the stories that started the week. Then, if that was not enough, by the time you get to October 24th, later in that same week, you have this particular article that shows up in the Washington Post. And again, this one has to do with the headlines alone say Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee paid for research that led to the Russian dossier. Now, this dossier was put together apparently by Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer, had ties to the FBI. It was brought through the Fusion GPS group, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, but it was a Washington firm to do kind of opposition research, and this was all facilitated by Mark Elias, or some people say Elias, either way you want to say his name. And again, this was very controversial for a couple of reasons. First of all, it involved some things I'm not going to talk about on a family program, but involved prostitutes, involved a number of other things that then might compromise Donald Trump. This also led to the independent counsel that we just talked about a minute ago, because after all, there was the possibility then of collusion. So one of the justifications for this idea of collusion had to do with a dossier which was false and paid for by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. Now, if that's not bad enough, then you also have individuals that have said that time and time again, individuals that were involved with the Clinton campaign or the Democratic National Committee lied about their involvement. And also, every time somebody does point out some connection, nobody seems to recall. Everybody seems to not be sure about this.
Short-term memory. No, there is so much to really unpack here. But I think if I could just summarize it, the bottom line is the very thing that the Trump administration is being investigated for, there is actual hard proof that the DNC and the Clinton campaign accomplished, and they have colluded with the Russians to find dirt on Trump. Comey even used it to allow FISA to begin some of the investigations against Trump. I mean, this dossier has been used not just by the DNC, but it's become something that the taxpayer dollars are funding now, and that we're having to hear about 10 months later as the American public and the never-ending news cycle coverage of Trump. And the truth is, we have the very fact that the Clinton Foundation did the same thing, and they continue to just rail against the Russians for influencing the American election when they used the Russians to influence the American election. The hypocrisy just is flabbergasts me. I don't understand.
Here's what the Wall Street Journal said just a couple of days ago. This is the editorial board. It turns out that Russia has sown distrust in the U.S. political system, aided and abetted by the Democratic Party.
That's right.
And perhaps the FBI. And they said this is an about-face from the dominant media narrative of last year and requires a full investigation. And, of course, they talk about the Washington Post revealed that Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee jointly paid for the infamous dossier full of Russian disinformation against Donald Trump. And they go through then all the ways in which that's going through Fusion GPS, tapped Christopher Steele, going through that. But they then cut to the chase. I love this. Strip out the middlemen. It appears the Democrats paid for Russians to compile wild allegations about a presidential candidate Did somebody say collusion? Now, this is sometimes called in psychology projection. You know, a person that sometimes will say, you're a liar, that's because they're a liar. Or I don't believe that you're telling the truth, because sometimes they aren't the ones telling the truth.
That's
and
right.
Here, I think this was a direct and deliberate misdirection. As they got closer to these investigations, I think there were some people that realized, we are guilty of collusion, so we'll accuse the other group, the other campaign of collusion. And, of course, you had enough with Paul Manafort and a few others, and we might even get into one or two of the others that could be indicted to make that stick. And so that's where the press has been focused all of its time and attention on, is there any collusion between Donald Trump and the various Russian connections? When the real issue was, you have Russians working with steel, because a lot of this came from the Russian groups, to the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. So who would have guessed this?
And we have to think of the unconstitutional results as well that this really stood for. So what happened was, after that, the Obama administration had a hard push to what they call unmask or reveal the identities and names of American people and government officials illegally. That's unconstitutional violation. And another, I think, abuse of power that occurred was the fact that they had surveillance of the Trump team. And we all remember Nixon. I mean, I think we all remember Nixon and the result of that. The difference is,
those of us older remember more than you do.
Yes. Yes. I mean, they had illegal surveillance. There was just a whole lot of injustices that occurred and rights that were violated in the wake of all of this. Not to mention the fact that my personal favorite part is, after all of this, Hillary still lost. I mean, it wasn't enough. But the one thing that this article did aptly point out is that Putin still got his way. There was chaos in the American political system.
Yes. Well, and we'll come back from the break and talk a little bit more about that. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But some of this was breaking, and the reason this story broke originally goes back to someone who deserves high praise, and that is Representative Devin Nunes, who is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who kind of recused himself for a while, but maybe he can come back now and look at this again, because after all, that's why the story broke, because he was able to get bank records from Fusion GPS, and that uncovered all of these stories, which, again, it may not be real until the Washington Post covers it, but when it shows up in the Washington Post, then you have to pay attention to it. But yesterday, during the Talking Head shows, nobody seemed to pay attention to it. And matter of fact, you can actually look at the transcripts. I think somebody was actually looking at the one for Meet the Press, which is kind of the gold standard for a lot of these press coverages, and they didn't talk about it at all. And so, again, it may be the requirement of other alternative media, maybe like Point of View and others, to keep the story going, because still the mainstream press hasn't found that very interesting. And, of course, remove that and change it around. Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee paid for research for a dossier, it's front page news. And so it just, again, illustrates that we still have a little bit of a bias in the press. And if you don't think so, I have some swampland I would love to sell you. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about a couple of other issues, a lot on the table still, and we'll be back right after this.
At dinner recently, I was struck by the couple in front of me. They were allegedly spending a night out together, but the only time they communicated in a half hour was one time when the man showed what was on his phone to the woman, and then back to their own screens. We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You'll find us online with your phone, your tablet, your laptop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues. You can also follow our new YouTube video series, Uncensored. Stay informed. Follow us on Twitter at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Again, at Point of View RTS. We'd love you to retweet us, to share our Facebook posts, but please don't do it when you're out with your family or someone you love. We can wait. We're online 24 hours a day. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join a conversation. Chelsey Youman with us today, and again, she is with First Liberty, and we're talking about all sorts of issues in the news, and if you would like to talk about some of the corruption in campaign, that is certainly the case, but I thought we would move on to some other issues. One of those is an article that we've actually made available for people, Sexual Freedom and Respect for Women. But before we get to it, do have to at least mention this for our sports fans out there, and that is yesterday you thought that maybe we were coming to an end of all the people that were going to kneel at the football game. Well, not for the Houston Texans. Now, there's a very good reason for that, and that is the owner, interestingly enough, Bob McNair, in a speech conversation that he had at one point said, we can't have the inmates running the prison. Okay, that's one that you don't want to use. He probably could have gotten away with it if he said inmates running the asylum, which is what I've heard before. Or I've heard other phraseology where people have said in the banking industry, I don't want the tellers running the bank. Or the cruise ship, I don't want the entertainers piloting the ship. But the point is they took it meaning that they were the inmates in prison. He's more than once said, that's not what I said. I was not referring to our players when I made a very regretful comment during the owners meeting last week. I was referring to the relationship between the league office and the team owners and how they've been making significant strategic decisions affecting our league without adequate input from the ownership over the last couple of years. So he's not even talking about the players. But nevertheless, everybody had to get offended, and so most of the Houston Texans took the knee yesterday. So here we go again, Chelsey.
Not very great for office morale building. I think they need a team building exercise as a team.
I think so. And again, I'd love to get any comments about that. Of course, last night everybody was watching the Houston Astros pull one out, so we'll see how the World Series goes. But this has just become more and more controversial, and the only point I thought I would make is the issue that we talk about so often is time and place. Time and place is taking the knee during the national anthem because you're upset what your owner said, whether that owner is Jerry Jones or whether that owner is Bob McNair. Is that the time and place? And there was a debate that was done recently at Channel 8, and one of our friends, Chelsey, was there. That is Debbie Georgiadis. And they had all sorts of people. They had Dale Hansen. They had people from all sorts of different things. And I wish they had invited me, because when they were doing this around the table, as soon as I was invited to speak, I was going to get out of my chair, get down on my knee, and hold up my fist and say, okay, does anybody feel like this is uncomfortable? And then say, well, now what I'm protesting is, and I would pick some, the opioid epidemic right now. I'm protesting the number of abortions that are taking place in America, protested the lack of free speech on campus or whatever, and then sit back up and say, okay, I look around the table. Most of you feel either very uncomfortable or very angry with what I just did. Why? Because this is not the time and place for me to take a knee around the table.
That's right.
If you didn't see the implications of what I'm saying, it's time and place. And that is when you take a knee during the national anthem, and then you expect that the American public are going to continue watching NFL games and think that that's the appropriate place for your protest, you can see the problem with trying to take a knee during those times.
Right. And I'm just ready for a little bit of creativity. I don't know about you, but you can't just steal everyone else's protest. Come up with your own protest. Do your own thing. Yeah. Well, I just think
do it at the press conference, anywhere.
If everything is a kneel, then nothing is a kneel. Everything is a protest. It loses its meaning completely. It's lost on your audience. It's lost on people watching. It's offensive to some. I think just really it would be time to come up with some creative messaging, guys. Use your heads and
that's big.
And also know what you're protesting. I think this is a really good example of he wasn't even talking about his players, but just the hype that gets involved and they need to take a stand. Well, he wasn't talking about you guys, and know the message, know what you're talking about, but it is at least something we're talking about now. So.
I would say. Well, again, some lessons to be learned. One of the phrases you may just want to ban from your lexicon is the inmates running the asylum or the inmates running the prison. That's never going to be a winner, and that certainly wasn't a winner there, even though I don't think he meant it in that regard. So, again, if you'd like to join us, these protests are another issue in the news, but I want to come to one of our articles here, and it gets back to a conversation that you had with Nick last week, and that is that we are seeing so many examples, and it seems like almost every day we have another one. Kevin Spacey this time in the news, and this one has to do with a homosexual issue, but nevertheless, just the whole issue of the harassment and all of the rest. And this piece by Rob Schulwalder has been with us before. Sexual freedom and respect for women. Which do you want? if indeed you cut loose and say, we want sexual freedom, we want individuals to actually express themselves sexually, we want people to be able to make love to anybody at any time in any situation, isn't it the women that are eventually going to be the ones that suffer in this situation?
Yes, Kerby. I mean, that's the irony of all of this, is in an era where everyone has eliminated any meaning from a sexual relationship, or even the consequences of sex outside of marriage or without contraception. You know, the pro-choice people will argue that you've really eliminated the need to protect women from men in an overly sexualized society who are going to start to say, well, if it means nothing, then they can take. And men, and we've seen this over the course of years, that men have frankly abandoned their innate, what should be in their DNA, to protect women, to be the protectors of society, to be proactive against evil. They've abandoned all of that because of feminism, and because they're told women don't need protecting, and women are just, objects. You can't have it both ways.
I would think so. You know, one of the things that we've talked about on this program just briefly is when Hugh Hefner died, everybody said, oh, what a great pioneer. And, of course, there are a number of people that wrote articles saying, well, not exactly, because once you then objectify women, and certainly that was the case of Hugh Hefner and Playboy, then you had the first problem. Then this piece by Rob talks about the second one, Cosmopolitan, which we haven't talked about as much. Helen Gurley Brown and others that were saying, well, women then need to be sexual animals as well. And you play those two magazines out and those two, if you will, sexual pioneers, and you have the problem of the hookup culture, you have the problem of addiction to pornography, and you have the problem in which we no longer show respect for anybody because, after all, the heart desires what the heart wants.
Right. And to remember, too, that the effects of Hugh Hefner made pornography an American household staple. I mean, he spent his entire life sexualizing our culture, and the effect of that is an erosion of the mind. And studies are showing the effect that pornography has on men's mind. Mm-hmm. It degrades their minds, and it really has terrible neurological effects on them that are going to come out eventually. And it's very base. And I mean, we even know statistics for a long time now that this is a far cry, but an extreme example of these types of base issues let go. I think every serial killer has been tied back to having a pornography addiction let go. I mean, so if you really look at the extreme examples of objectifying women and dehumanizing women, men become takers. And I think that it's something that I hope with all of the news coverage that is now getting traction, that people really dig into. And I hope that it starts to become a culture of change on this very important issue.
You know, some people might say, well, we just discovered this. Oh, yeah? 1986, there was what was called the Attorney General's Commission report on pornography. Some of the individuals involved with this were, first of all, Dr. Jim Dobson. It was put together by Ed Meese, the founder of what later has now been called the Alliance Defending Freedom. Was the individual that pulled it together. And back in 1986, they were actually documented, as you point out, that when they would find these sexual addicts, these serial killers, and they would then look at their computers or they would look at their homes and the pictures they had up, almost every single time they would find that they were involved in these kinds of things, which were, again, lauded recently when Hugh Hefner died. And so, again, you have this Time magazine, as it points out here, a glossy magazine cover to him and all the rest. And so that is certainly one issue. When we come back, this article also talks about something else. Before we point the finger too far, there are fingers pointing back the other way. And are Christians themselves somewhat guilty of this? And so we need to do what we can to speak to those issues as well. A matter of fact, I had your pastor in here the other day, Todd Wagner, and he talks about some of those issues. And we certainly have had our friends Noel Boucher of Pure Hope Ministries and others talking about that. So we'll get into those questions. But if you'd like to join us, talked about everything from the taking the knee at the Houston Texans game to the issue of sexual freedom and respect for women. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey with us today, and we have articles that we always like to post for you on the website, pointofview.net. So take the time to read some of those and to join us as we talk about these issues. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us or simply sit back and listen, 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey with us today. We're going to get into some of her areas as well. That is, we have also wanted to talk about these judicial nominees. But before we do that, let me just mention real quickly that Rob Schildwalzer, in his piece, also has a section that says Christians are guilty too. Now, Chelsey, for those of us that went to Promise Keepers, that was certainly an eye-opener. Years ago, they had these men's conferences called Promise Keepers in these big stadiums, and people would talk about, the issue of pornography. And that was one of the first times I began to realize that that was an issue, as well as some of these others. And so here he talks about a 2016 survey that shows that Christians are not immune from the incursions of a sexualized culture. Only about 50% of Catholics and evangelical Protestants believe that going out to dinner with someone you're attracted to constitutes cheating. Nearly 40% believe that going to a strip club betrays one's spouse. Then you start getting into Ashley Madison and some of these others. He gives us all sorts of stories, but nevertheless, it has to do with the fact that we've got to pay attention to the fact that we live in this highly sexualized culture, and Christians should be different, and sometimes they aren't.
Yes, and there are so many root causes, I'm sure, of all of these, and I know there are a lot of studies out there, but I have to get back to the fact that we have a watered down gospel in America, and that if we were truly gospel centered and if churches were doing their jobs and leaning in and talking about the hard issues and teaching on these hard issues, and then obviously addressing the heart changes that need to happen, sin is just a byproduct of a lack of relationship with Christ and a lack of becoming Christ, like I should say, and conviction. And so starting there would be a great place. But I think up until recently, churches might not have had any clue how prevalent and pervasive this issue was, and that they are, our young men in our churches are not immune from the culture they're a part of, and they needed teaching and upbringing about this. And when at least the churches I grew up in, if you ever said the word pornography or sex from the pulpit, I mean, I can't imagine the look on the grandma's faces in the congregation. It's just such a taboo topic to speak about.
Well, again, we had Mark Clark with us last week. We've interviewed him before. He is kind of a mega church pastor in Canada, and his latest book has a whole chapter on sex. And so the other day I asked him about that, and he said, well, part of the problem is we don't talk about it, or we do it in such a perverted way, not perverted, but maybe reduced way, that the culture just goes, well, why would I be interested in what you guys are talking about? Because you'll just ruin my life and actually no longer help us understand how to maybe see sex as valuable in our society. And I love what Rob says. He says, if we want a society that respects and protects women, we can't be a society in which sex is seen as the greatest value of our culture. Well, many times what we've done is we in the church have retreated from an interchange on those issues. And so whether it's David French, who has written about this, or whether it's Josh McDowell, who has certainly written books and research about this, whether it's, of course, Mark Clark and others, we need to come back and talk about what the biblical view of sex is, its place in marriage, its place in the family, and the fact that, frankly, people that are married and have sex are doing better. Even Cosmopolitan years ago had a study that said, the people having the best sex, these are married, committed individuals. Mm-hmm. Well, shout that from the housetops. Though grandmas might be a little bit offended by that, but we don't win the culture war when we retreat from the war. And when we don't address it from the pulpit, then the mixed messages in the culture are the ones that are in the minds of the individuals that are part of the body of Christ.
Right. And to think how broad this truly is, that the church also, failed to lean into the culture war back in the 80s with no-fault divorce. And there have been so many things along the way that really eroded society. The pillar of society is the family, and that includes marriage, and everything that entails a good, healthy marriage, as well as procreation and children and sex. And when the church stayed out of those issues, or kind of allowed those issues to really take over our culture, there's a marked shift in our culture, and now we're seeing the ramifications of that 20, 30 years later.
One of the other parts in the article there is millennials, since you're a millennial and we have our millennial roundtable, are less prone to divorce than any other segment of their population. That makes sense because they have been in the divorce culture. They have seen that. The divorce rate actually exploded in the 1970s. From about 1969 to 1981 or 82. The divorce rate essentially doubled. So we went from a time in which divorce was rare to a time in which divorce was routine. And so growing up around so much divorce, I have found that millennials oftentimes are a little more tentative about getting married, much less likely to get divorced, and in some respects maybe are bringing the culture back to some norms that we haven't had for some time.
Yes, I think I read a statistic around a third of millennials will never get married. Yes. That is astounding to me.
Yes.
And then we also talked about on the break, actually, Kerby, that some people are moving in together and cohabitating before they get married. And this just goes back to the gospel, and that really we're understanding God has your best in mind when he sets these bumpers up for us,
Yes.
that it's not just to say no to all the fun things. It's because he understands and there are very real consequences of sin. And one of those consequences in the category of cohabitation is a higher divorce rate later down the line. And we actually had a pastor come speak to our church, Scott Stanley, and he's written multiple books and a lot of research. He's kind of a counseling psychologist, and he did the longest longitudinal study of cohabitating couples, and he came up with this theory called slide versus decide. And he said that couples who slide into commitment are the ones that end up in counseling. They start gradually moving in together, eventually just get married because that's the next thing to do. And in counseling years later, the fact they can't point to a moment where a decision was made to commit, a moment where they decided, that ends up being a massive cause for divorce in the future. So there's just some interesting tidbits for our listeners. Hopefully interesting. I'm interested in it.
I am. Well, and again, Scott Stanley has written in the past, and we've had him on this program, but it's been years. We need to get him back on that issue about why marriages fail, the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse, and John Gottman and other people have talked about that. But that's kind of intriguing because other studies that have been done, Scott Stanley's a Christian, but even studies that have been done by non-Christians at Rutgers, same thing. They recognize that your likelihood of a divorce after cohabitation goes up. You know, most people, Chelsey, that are part of the culture say, well, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on. You know, you wouldn't, buy a car without a test drive. I said, yeah, but the car doesn't get offended if you don't choose it. You don't leave any of your belongings in the trunk of the car. So it's a bad analogy. But actually, studies that have been done both by non-Christians and Christians recognize that when you live together, and sort of the philosophy is as long as love shall last until death do us part, well, then you never really develop the characteristics necessary to resolve any kind of conflict. And so, again, just another aspect of that. But slide before you glide and all that. We have to get him back on because he certainly, obviously, deserves some attention. And we'll see if we can give him some attention here at Point of View. Let's take a break, though. We've talked a little bit about sexual freedom and respect for women. We come back, we'll spend some time talking about what's happening in the courts, and in particular, the judicial nominees. For a long time, there has been this slide in a different sense, maybe even a slow walk of these nominees. Is that going to pick up? And as I've been traveling over the last couple of weeks, I've been in Alaska, I've been in Oregon, I've been in California. The number one question, Chelsey, is this. Are we ever going to get these nominees through the courts? First of all, through the Senate and then into the courts. And so we'll talk about that for just a minute. Also have some things about Wikipedia. Interesting enough, Robert Knight calls it Wackipedia, so we'll talk about what that means. And at any point along the way, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to find some of the articles we're referencing, you can find those at our website, pointofview.net, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation in the second hour right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary. because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey in studio with us today with First Liberty. And for just a few minutes, we might even talk about what's available on the website for First Liberty, because this, again, is a great resource. So if you go to our website right now, click on the picture of her. It will take you to firstliberty.org. Lots of very important cases there right now. And again, if you wanted to follow some of these that involve everything from prayer in the public schools to tearing down a cross in Maryland to a group that said, wait a minute, we're a Christian school, the Cambridge Christian School, and we got two Christian schools, and we wanted to pray on the loudspeaker, but you can't do that because I guess it's a secular microphone, or all the other cases that they were involved with. They can go to firstliberty.org and find some great resources, can't they?
There are certainly no shortage of religious liberty cases for you to peruse online, or issues that we deal with. But yes, most recently Cambridge was a really big issue. I know you guys talked about that Friday.
We did on Friday. And again, for people that aren't familiar, in case you weren't listening, possibly that you weren't, this involved two Christian schools in Florida. They're having their state championship in the religious league, okay? They're at a stadium, and they said, well, we always have a prayer before the game, and the administration says, no, we can't do that. Well, why not? So then you go and try to work it out, and now you're having to go to if you will, court documents to deal with the obvious thing.
Right.
And you keep every step along the way. Chelsey, I keep thinking, certainly common sense is going to break out. But it just sometimes never does.
Never ceases to amaze me when that doesn't happen. But no, you're right. What we essentially have are two Christian schools with two players that on their own right at their own championship game want to pray. And if they were at their own private fields, they could have done so, but because they were using a state facility, the state intervened and said, you cannot pray because we own the mic.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's as simple as that. But if you really take this out a bit, our president, Kelly Shackelford, had a really great point, of course. And he said that would be like saying you can't preach from the sidewalk and be a sidewalk preacher because the city technically owns the sidewalk. I mean, where is the limiting principle in this decision? So we'll definitely be appealing this decision to the 11th Circuit Court. We're hopeful, obviously, for them to overturn the district court decision that won't allow two Christians to pray before their own private event.
And again, each step along the way, again, I don't want to belabor it, but you think, okay, the administrator for the school, for the district, I should say, for the public facility, you would think, oh, sure, Christian schools, no big deal. Nope. We go to the administration. Nope. And now we're at the district court. Nope. I mean, you have to go so high to just get, hopefully, a reasonable decision. We'll see.
I think the biggest thing I want to communicate to people is that just because a court says in this one area of the country, it's out of Florida, that this is illegal, they can be wrong. Okay. Yes. And so we have across the entire country at the very opposite end, out of Birmingham, Washington, we have a coach who was fired for kneeling at the end. He was a public school employee, but at the end of a football game, he would kneel at the 50-yard line and do a brief prayer, sometimes even silently. How they know he was praying is beyond me, but just by himself, and then players sometimes would join him or not. But the point being that the court ruled out of that area of the country as well that that's illegal because anyone could see him. So anyone from the public could see his expression. And that, again, means that a public official couldn't wear a cross necklace or a Star of David or a yarmulke. So we have some very extreme examples coming out of the courts right now. And it's important to press into that and say, actually, we have 225 years of religious liberty protections that say that students don't lose their right and public officials don't lose their religious liberty rights just because they go into the schoolhouse doors.
Yes. And again, I might expect that in Bremerton, Washington, because you don't
maybe a little more. Yeah.
But this is in Florida. So again, whether it's one corner of the country in the Washington state or the other corner of the country in Florida, there is the case. So again, we're broadcasting today in Texas, and so we'll hear some of those comments as well. And I think if nothing else, that makes the case for why we need better judges in some of these courts. And so here we have a situation in which up until fairly recently, there has been this slowing down process of these judges. One of the ones we talked about Friday with Kelly Shackelford was a individual that was actually nominated by the previous president, Barack Obama, then renominated by Donald Trump, and Chuck Schumer slows that one down and has 30 hours of debate for an individual that I think would be acceptable to both Republicans and Democrats. If Barack Obama put him forward, I would imagine that Chuck Schumer would have no problem with it, but still, they slowed down the debate even on this individual.
Right. They have definitely committed to slow walking these nominations because I think they know what's at stake here. Well, first of all, part of it's probably revenge a little bit for their nominee not getting any momentum. So at this point, they're losing a lot of credibility because even former Obama appointees who have now been reappointed, there's one out of Oklahoma, there's a slow walk on all of them, regardless of their background, regardless of their ability to determine these cases. But they know what the ramifications are, and that is the fact that President Trump has over 145 vacancies to fill. So we, as attorneys, call that a judicial crisis.
I would say so.
500,000 cases are in the district courts in our country, 500,000. And out of the Fifth Circuit, they're shorthanded by, I think it's 3 positions right now. So there's really a shorthand of judges deciding really important cases and controversies of the American people. But that's such an opportunity when you think of it, because Obama, he was very slow to appoint, and Clinton as well, in their first few years. They were very slow to appoint judicial nominees, and Obama was still able to turn 11 out of 13 circuit courts liberal in his 8 years. And I think that Trump has about double of those vacancies now. So he really, in 4 years, if he could get momentum, it could be the biggest sea change and biggest impact he has on American culture and jurisprudence.
You know, you think about the impact that these individuals have. Let's look at the Supreme Court for a minute. We'll take a break. And one is to talk about Justice Kennedy. By February, he will have been on the court for 40 years. Wow. 1988, 40 years. The other day, they were asking Ruth Bader Ginsburg if she would retire, and she said, well, when I came on the court, I was going to do the same thing Justice Brandeis did, because Justice Brandeis came in when he was 60, and she came in when she was 60. Justice Brandeis stepped down after 23 years when he was 83. She's 83 and turning 84, but she's not stepping down. But nevertheless, you can see that these individuals, in the case of Kennedy, was appointed by Ronald Reagan. In the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, appointed by Bill Clinton. So these individuals, whether it's in the Supreme Court or the appeals court or the district court, sometimes they stay for a very long period of time. So let's come back and talk about a few of those. Also, I think you've done some numbers on if we keep the current process going, how long it would take to fill the court up. It would be a lot longer than Donald Trump's 8 years, assuming he even serves for 8 years, and we'll give you those numbers in just a minute. If you'd like to join us, again, you are welcome to do so, or just sit back and listen. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to find some of the articles we're talking about today, they're available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The plight of persecuted Christians is worse than ever. That is the conclusion of a recent report by Aid to the Church in Need. It documents that persecution of Christians today is worse than at any time in history. Not only are Christians more persecuted than any other faith groups, but ever-increasing numbers are experiencing the very worst forms of persecution. In some countries, the situation is already severe, so it's hard to imagine how it could be any worse. Other countries, like China, have seen intolerance on the rise, as evidenced by a clampdown on dissident clergy and the destruction of churches. In light of this, I was deeply convicted by my recent interview with Johnny Moore. He came on Point of View to talk about his book, The Martyr's Oath. He begins the book, and we began our interview by talking about attending a Bible school graduation ceremony. The students repeated this martyr's oath in which they pledged their lives and death to Jesus. He felt like he was standing in the book of Acts, witnessing a raw first-century Christianity that had been shielded from him in America. It says things like, "As he has given his life for me, so I'm willing to give my life for him. I will use every breath I possess to boldly proclaim his gospel." It later goes on to say, "Though persecution may come, I know my battle is not against flesh, but against the forces of evil. I will not hate those whom God has called me to love. Therefore I will forgive when ridiculed, show mercy when struck, and love when hated." Johnny Moore often asks himself, why are so few of us in America willing to live for Jesus when others are so willing to die for him? It's a good question all of us should ask ourselves. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Going to the break, and I didn't do my math quite right, and that is 1988. February of 1988 is when Mr. Kennedy, indeed Anthony Kennedy, was appointed and confirmed. That's 30 years, not 40 years, but still 30 years in February on the court. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg coming on saying, you know, I want to kind of have the same pattern as Justice Brandeis, who also was appointed to the court in his 60s. Actually, both of them were 60, and he served for 23 years. Well, she served for 23 years, but she's not stepping down like Justice Brandeis did, and probably will be there for a couple of more because they are well aware that if indeed any of the liberals on the court, and we're talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or we're talking about some of the other appointees on the court, of which there are 2 from Clinton and 2 from Obama, if they step down, they're pretty sure that Donald Trump is going to appoint more conservative members to the court. So we'll see how that plays out. If this trend continues, I think you guys have done the research, what would it take at the slow walk that we are having right now in the Senate for us to eventually fill up the court? Have you done any estimates on that?
We yes, we have. We've really walked that out. But we're talking about 150 vacancies around. So it's really gone up. He started with about 121, right, I believe. Yeah. So we've gone up even since then with judges who I think admirably are saying, okay, now's the time to have my seat be replaced by another conservative. They're retiring. They're stepping out. And at this point, we have 56 judicial nominees appointed, so roughly, we'll say a third. which is astounding, by the way. Astounding amount.
Amazing.
He has really done his grunt work, and I think he deserves some kudos for that, for the fact that he's gotten 56 nominees. The problem is Senate can debate for 30 hours for each individual. So we ran the math on that, and for every nominee, even if Trump nominated for all 150 vacancies, the Senate would take 13 years if they debated 30 hours on every individual. It would take 13 years to fill those vacancies. And the Democrats are proving that that's exactly what they want to do. And so what we need to do is first push blue slips to be signed. I think there are a number of Democrat senators from the state. They have to sign it's kind of a formality, really. Yes. A blue slip is what it's called, to approve the nominee in their own state. So Democrats are obviously trying to slow this process down, aren't returning their blue slips. And then Democrat senators actually on the Hill are trying to debate for 30 hours and delay. We really have only, I think, six or seven confirmed at this rate. So this is really, it's astounding to me how effective they're frankly able to be. And that's because we have to have 50 of the 52 Republicans to vote on each nominee. We have to keep that block tight. And any of the more moderate Republicans, if we don't keep that block together and aligned, we're not going to get our nominees.
Well, and again, there are ways to solve that. First of all, Mitch McConnell made it real clear that this blue slip tradition is just a tradition. There are certain senators, Al Franken, and others that will not turn in their blue slip. And this was done in the past because, after all, an individual from a particular state, since I'm picking on Minnesota, we'll continue to pick on Minnesota for a minute, would say, well, I might know more about this particular judge than you do, so I will hand in a slip saying this is fine, that you can go ahead with the nomination, or I will withhold it because I have a problem that maybe you don't know about, but I know about because I'm from that state. But it's only been a tradition, and so Mitch McConnell can say, well, we're not going to allow this tradition to hold that up. The other is, okay, if you're going to play this game of always wanting to have a cloture vote and have 30 hours to debate, there's another solution there. That's just keep the Senate in session. The difficulty with that is holding those 50 cats, because you have to herd cats in there, together. And one of those cats isn't real healthy, Thad Cochran in particular. So doing that might be difficult. But again, if the trend continues, it will take 13 years to just even fill those that are vacancies right now. But at least we do have some votes coming up on a couple of judges. One, a Michigan Supreme Court Judge, Joan Larson, a California Supreme Court Justice, Allison Eid, also University of Pennsylvania law professor Stefanos Bilbas, and then the one that has become very controversial, shouldn't have been, Notre Dame law professor Amy Coney Barrett. And again, Amy Coney Barrett is not all that controversial unless your name is Dianne Feinstein. Mm-hmm. And that was the issue there because she is Catholic and because she really believes Catholic doctrine. That doctrine, apparently, according to Dianne Feinstein, speaks too loudly. And so that's been a real controversy as well, hasn't it, Chelsey?
Yes, it absolutely has. I believe they got into her religious beliefs and questioned her, which the Constitution actually expressly prohibits. So There's not even a gray area of the law here to discuss. And there may be no religious test for anyone to join public service and work for the government. And so we definitely see that really all gloves are off in the Senate at this time. It's a free-for-all, and they are going after anyone and everyone for their personal views, their personal religious beliefs. They have some staunch roadblocks in place at this point. And I'm hoping McConnell changes the 30-hour debate rule. I mean, I don't know what's stopping him at this point. I actually don't know.
Time to do that, yeah.
That would be a really effective way to just get these through, because imagine the amount of sheer capital and taxpayer dollars that the Senate is wasting right now on just this stalling tactic. They have other jobs to do as well.
And some are saying maybe we can modify it from 30 hours to 8 hours. Okay, we still deserve a debate and discussion, but this is ridiculous. But back to Amy Barrett for just a minute. The problem with her is that not that she's Catholic, but that she believes it. Think about this for a minute. We have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Last time I did an analysis, there's 6 of them are Catholic. But the point is, it's one thing to be a Catholic But apparently for Dianne Feinstein, it's another thing to be a Catholic and believe Catholic doctrine.
Right.
In other words, we have no problem at all with some of the Catholics, whether it's Kennedy or Breyer or whoever it might be, that are, after all, not necessarily all that tied to Catholic dogma, as she said. The real issue is that we actually have somebody from Notre Dame who's a law professor who is Catholic, who actually believes Catholic doctrine, and that might be a problem on the Supreme Court.
Can you imagine someone who's principled about their religious beliefs? I mean, I think we all both have our own opinions about this, but you would want to know that the people that you're nominating for these seats, that they believe in something and that they adhere to that, that they're just not flighty and will go wherever the wind takes them. I mean, you want principled people of justice deciding these cases. It's very important. Not to mention that she was on the Supreme Court shortlist. There are a number of these circuit court nominees who potentially someday, if we do have another vacancy on the Supreme Court, will presumably be nominated for those seats. And so that's another thing to keep in mind.
Well, and again, this would put her on the Seventh Circuit. Of course, the if you will, the farm club oftentimes for the Supreme Court is the D.C. Circuit, but that doesn't necessarily always hold there either. So is this another reason, Chelsey, why there is such a pushback, recognizing that some of these individuals get high enough that then they can be picked later on to be going to circuit courts and appeals courts and things like that? So they're looking at people in the district courts that could go in the circuit courts. They're looking at people in the circuit courts that could go in the Supreme Court, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And this might be an unintentional consequence of publishing your short list, although Trump ran on this issue, and I think he won on this issue. He garnished a lot of unity and support out of the conservative bloc, knowing that how many vacancies there were, that we are in a judicial crisis, and that he had a Supreme Court nominee, at least one on the line. So the fact that her name is on a short list, as are a few other of these circuit court nominees, no doubt that they have a big old target on their back.
I would think so. One of the questions I get so often is, what about these nominees? Are we going to get them through? The second question is, well, how good are these nominees? And I said, well, Kelly Shackelford, who oftentimes off air even shares concerns he has about people that we all like, has really been very positive. But the comment I make every once in a while is, do you realize that some of the people that have been working for Kelly Shackelford and with you at First Liberty are actually nominated for the court right now? And those are individuals that really have a target on their back, don't they?
Oh, they definitely do. I mean, if you're again, go back, if you're too tied to your beliefs, then you're going to get a target on your back. That's just the name of the game. But everyone who has been nominated, I applaud them because they're willing to put their lives on the line. They have to divulge so much personal information. Yes. Their families are involved. Their families receive threats. And even, a judge that I interned with in law school, who is a Clinton nominee, here in town, said, I turned Clinton down the very first time he wanted to nominate me because it's just such a grueling process. And then he said the president called and he said, you don't turn the president down twice. And so he ultimately was nominated. But we have to remember these are humans too, and they're people too, and that they have families. But they're going to undergo a lot, in order to really fight the good cop fight.
Well, again, if you want to write a letter to the editor or put out a Facebook page, 56 nominees put forward, 150 vacancies. If they keep it up and take 13 years, we got to do something different. We'll be back with more right after this.
Modern life is go, 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 and Point of View is absolutely ready to go with you. I dare say that most of us have access to either a smartphone or a tablet, maybe even a computer that is app-based. There's a new way to keep up with Kerby and the team, the free Point of View radio app. With quick links to listen to the program live, to keep up and share Kerby's meaty and insightful viewpoints, commentaries, read articles on issues we're talking about that impact you and your family. Did you know you can also watch the show? Yes, radio with cameras. You can access that through the app as well. There's a link to our action alerts, how to find us on the radio across the nation, ways to contact us, and so much more. Visit your app store, iTunes or Google Play. Search for the Point of View radio app. There's no reason not to take us with you. The free Point of View radio app, available now for Apple and Android devices. And when you get it loaded, there's one more button I'd like you to press, the one that says Donate Now. Join Truth Team 360. Support us financially as we support you with the truth that you need. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey in studio with us today, and can we have a link to First Liberty Institute. And Chelsey, one of the things I enjoy about this particular program that we're doing today is that in the past, we've always, at Point of View, we've on national program. We have 300 radio stations. So there isn't much of an opportunity to talk about what happens in Texas. Now, sometimes we do anyway, because what happens in Texas doesn't stay in Texas. It goes around the country. But given the fact that right now we're only broadcasting in a radio station in Dallas, that gives us a chance to talk about Texas politics, which we never do because most stations around the country go, well, we really don't care. You know, if you talk about something that happened in Dallas, 299 stations don't care. If you talk about what's happened in Texas, about 280 stations don't care because they're in other states or they're in other cities. But we have something unfolding here that is very unique, and that is for many years we have seen a situation in which good legislation in the Senate, the Texas Senate, goes to the House to die. This is sort of the reverse of what we've seen nationally. That is, we've seen over these last couple of months, really good legislation from the House of Representatives goes to the U.S. Senate to die. Now, the reason it's reversed in Texas is due to the fact that the lieutenant governor basically runs the Senate, and he's a conservative. But when you get to the House, the person that runs the House is the Speaker of the House, who is charitably called a moderate. I think you could even use some other words, but we'll leave it at that.
There probably have been some other words used.
And so all of a sudden, now Mr. Strauss, Joe Strauss, is stepping down. Does that give an opportunity for various kinds of pieces of legislation that have never been able to see the light of day in the state of Texas, especially in the House of Representatives?
We certainly hope so. I mean, there has been bill after bill after bill that has either been stalled or completely just completely abandoned and left to no call for a vote, because especially very conservative social bills that our state really holds dear and cares about deeply because of his more moderate tendencies. So the Republican bloc, I think, is definitely doing a happy dance, at least the last week, over this.
You know, one of the things that they used to say in the United States House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House would oftentimes be very heavy-handed. And there was the old phrase to get along, go along. And there hasn't been such a heavy-handed Speaker of the House, maybe a little bit John Boehner, certainly not Paul Ryan. But that same kind of mindset has really existed in the Texas House because the Speaker of the House, Strauss, has oftentimes even seemed to retaliate against individuals. And maybe over the next couple of months, we'll get in maybe Representative Jeff Leach, because he actually called a press conference saying, you know, we've put up with this for too long. You know, conservatives not only are not given an opportunity to see their legislation going to the floor, there has even been sometimes retaliation. So this next battle, and I would imagine it's going to be a battle because you've already had a number of people announcing that they're going to run for the Texas Speaker of the House, could be pretty significant, not only in terms of legislation, but if they want to sell popcorn and charge admission, I think there are going to be people who are going to be watching this because it's going to be pretty intense, don't you think?
Oh, yes. It's just like the rest of the nation. I think the Republican Party in the state of Texas has its own fragments and divisions internally. We've got the Tea Party on one side, who are conservative on all issues, and we have the establishment, which in the state of Texas really are economically conservative individuals who socially are not that conservative and moderate. Right. And the divide between those two, it has been such a tug of war between those two sides in our state. And we've had a lot of big business move to Texas because, of course, we vote conservative and conservative politics wins. And ultimately, businesses are being drawn to that. So with that comes a little bit of a shift in dynamic in the conservative party. And those tensions have risen. But ultimately, conservatives in our House want other conservatives leaders. And I think that's been proven true. They came out pretty strongly against Strauss in the last few years, and it's finally come to a head.
Well, and one of the other issues, let's talk about Google moving its headquarters possibly to Texas, but at the same time, and Amazon and some of those headquarters, as well as Apple is in the the Austin area and things like that. But you deal with the legislation because we were constantly told we can't have this bathroom bill because that's just not going to be good. Because we want Amazon here, we want Google here, we want Apple here, we want all sorts of other industries here. They are going to not be attracted to the state of Texas. So this will be another battle kind of in the periphery, who you have as Speaker of the House and whether he or she allows certain legislation to the floor to be voted on could affect big business and the kind of ability to attract business to the state of Texas.
Right. There are definitely a lot of shifting dynamics in our state to be looking at. We know State Farm has already moved here. Amazon's looking at moving here.
Right.
And the dynamic, I've heard a rumor even recently that people are saying, well, maybe it's because the CEO of Amazon is so liberal that he wants to shake up Texas politics. And really moving 30,000 jobs here can do that, especially if they're all Californians. So we really, as a state, need to kind of quit having an identity crisis here on what kind of brand of conservative we're going to be, and really sticks to our strong principled messaging and platforms, and say, if they're trying to turn our state blue, then we really have to have a united front and get some important bills passed to protect the rights of Texans.
Well, and again, it's so interesting because on the one hand, you have some of these companies that are coming from the West Coast, and you've already alluded to one of those, and they come from a more liberal blue state. You have, of course, State Farm came from a state that is blue in Chicago, but not where the headquarters were. But they all come for one reason, and that is this is a much better economic environment. So will they, in some cases, put up with the social issues because they love the economic environment? Or, as you said, will they come and try to turn Texas into another California or Texas into another Illinois?
Right. We saw a lot of testimony, if anyone followed, doubtful that you followed it as much as I did, but the Texas legislature last year, confessions, you followed some of the testimony of the Better Business Bureaus out of our state saying, some of these liberal policies, if we don't adopt these liberal policies, it's bad for business. And when you actually look at the numbers, I think it was less than 0.1% of our economy was going to be affected by having socially conservative policies. That's important to remember and to say, there are a lot of empty threats out there. There are a lot of focus groups and interest groups that, frankly, need to stay out of our state and let us run our business the way we run our business. It's obviously working.
Well, and again, we had the last Super Bowl in Houston, and of course, it was so funny that there were people saying this is going to really affect business and all the rest. Okay, do you not understand that we have a lesbian mayor in Houston, okay? But we also have some of these bills, and it's still a very free state. As a matter of fact, the more you pursue freedom, whether it's religious freedom or economic freedom, the better it's going to be for your business, right?
That's right. It doesn't really matter what the brand of freedom is to us. I think the point is to allow the economy to do its own thing, and that's proven to be effective.
Well, anyway, I just thought we would mention that this battle for the Speaker of the House may be one of those opportunities, since this is, especially on Monday at 9 o'clock, from 9 to 11, in just the Texas area. We'll have a chance to bring in some of those possible candidates. I know we already had planned today, and we will in the future have some candidates for the Texas Senate, and I'd love to talk to some of the individuals that might actually be a speaker for the House. So those would be a couple other issues to mention. But let me bring one story to the table that just came this morning. Robert Knight's been on the program with us many times before, and he talks about Wikipedia. And he says, as a Wikipedia editor, I've made many edits and updates over the years to the American Civil Rights Union's Wikipedia page without interference. So imagine my shock when I was alerted this past Monday that someone had made the page revert to an old version with content deleted and outright errors inserted. I went online and corrected a few things, but my corrections were immediately and instantaneously undone. Then it got worse. On Wednesday, another editor removed a lion's share of content describing their activities. Gone were entire sections on election law, environmental regulation, gun laws, and religious freedom. Some of the worst damage was done to the personnel section. Judge Robert Bork, who died in 2012, was updated as a policy board member. James Q. Wilson, who died also in 2012, was on the list. And he goes on and on and on with all the problems that he's had. And this is due to the fact, as I've mentioned on this program before, that you have some what I call internet trolls out there. And they are really dedicated to trying to do what they can to affect websites. And, of course, they can't hack into the websites, although some do, but they can certainly fix or modify Wikipedia. And so when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that for a little bit, because I want to share a little bit more about his own experience. But you've had the same experience there at First Liberty, haven't you?
I hate to admit it on air, but yes, we have. We have.
Well, and another individual, Bill Dembski, is a very prominent individual in the so-called intelligence design movement. And he's had all these anti-ID and anti-intelligence design, pro-evolution people changing his own website. And he's actually appealed to those people saying, can I not at least have the facts accurately about who I am? But no, we can't even have that, which is another reason why I encourage you to have some discernment, even when you read Wikipedia. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilty remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those with whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call. Just sit back and listen. Chelsey with us, and I was reading from Robert Knight's piece. It just came out today in the Washington Times. He calls it Wikipedia, and this is something, again, I wanted to leave you with, the need for us to have some discernment, because he points out that these problems where every few days, sometimes a couple of times a day, individuals would change something on the Wikipedia site for them, and this is for the American Civil Rights Union, but this has been something I've written about for years with the internet trolls out there that guard certain pages. And, you go in there and try to make any change on one having to do with global warming, and instantaneously they'll change it back, even if you think there is a factual error, because they are just they just are on there guarding the page. Well, here are individuals not guarding the page, but they're actually trying to ruin the page. But the point he makes is what seems like at first just a trivial nuisance, outdated issue sections being left out or things of that nature, actually is indicative of the power those hostile to liberty have over those who defend it. He says, to a new generation, Wikipedia is the Encyclopedia Britannica, but without factual safeguards. He says virtually all the updates I added over several years were deleted. According to the site history, the revisions by several, quote, editors began this past April and continue right up to this week. He says, when I contacted a wiki administrator who was listed as one of the revisers, I was told that because of my ties to the group, I am an ACRU senior fellow, I have a conflict of interest and could not fix anything myself. Instead, I should review a complicated procedure for suggesting edits, which may or may not be made. My request to restore my previous edits in order to correct them was flatly denied. So you can see that it's getting worse as time goes on, that you can't even update your own page. And, of course, I used the example a minute ago. Bill Dembski says, look, Wikipedia just has things that are factually incorrect about me. I didn't say this. I'm not here. This is where I was born. I mean, just things that are just totally crazy. And when Wikipedia says, well, we can't let you fix those because, after all, it's your page, so you are biased. Well, yes, but can't I at least have my own page? Yeah, it's called Facebook, but you can't have it in Wikipedia.
Well,
so
Wikipedia,
it's getting out of hand.
You know, when I was in high school, if you cited to Wikipedia, you failed, period. Yes. But it has become quite the keeper of truth, apparently. And I think it's a dangerous thing that we should probably think about, because when you have people, you have to look at who is in control of the information we're allowed to receive or not receive, for that matter. Who knows more about their institution or their product or identity, for that matter, than the organizations themselves that are on Wikipedia. And so to completely preclude them from any input on how you categorize them, that's a dangerous thing. People, as you mentioned, are using this as a factual site now, and they're using it looking, and if they just so much as change one word, I know our organization has had issues. We're saying, you know, this one word actually completely miscategorizes us. It precludes us from getting certain types of clients who maybe won't be interested or will be turned off by the things they're reading that aren't true about us. You know, it's a really dangerous power that Google and all of these entities on the internet that are completely unregulated really have.
You know, one of the things he says near the end of the article is this malicious trashing of the ACRU's Wikipedia page is not unlike the damage done to Christian charities by the Southern Poverty Law Center's false designation of them as hate groups, because then that affects their financial stuff. Then he goes on to talk about something we mentioned the other day, and that is PragerU sues Google and YouTube for censoring their videos. So again, these are the individuals that control information. Now, let me be real clear. This is not necessarily a First Amendment issue. After all, Google and YouTube own their site, so they can decide who they want to have on or who they want to kick off, but they're using the internet, and they become so big, they're almost like monopolies. So when Prager University says we can't even have people watch our videos because they're using a restricted mode filtering there, it isn't necessarily a First Amendment issue, but it is a censorship issue, isn't it?
It's definitely a censorship issue. It's not the government doing the censoring, but it's almost scarier because it's these groups and organizations and companies who we don't know who are running them. I mean, we presume, I guess, that they're liberal just because we saw, you know, some of the issues out of the last election where any conservative media or positive media on Trump was bumped to page 6 of Google. No one's going to click that far, you know, but they definitely they control the information we have access to, and they can shape the American public's thereby shape the American public's opinion. And I think it's an immense amount of power that they have. I sympathize with the American public who says, well, where do I get real facts? Where do I get real information? And my answer is it's hard, and we have to do our research, and we have a duty to continue to lean in and say, that sounds a little bit biased, or that sounds like the wrong angle at this, and continue to research and find sites that maybe have a better, more well-rounded view.
Well, I hope you will come to our website, because lots of times people say, well, where do you get that? Well, then you can go to the
That's
website
right.
and
Point
find
of view.
that. And back to your point, since we're almost out of time, there are 2 studies that have just come out recently, one by Robert Epstein, and again, talking about social media companies are the gatekeepers, and again, and this is, again, looking at probably pretty much from a liberal point of view, but acknowledging just what you pointed out, that when you looked at the various Google searches, you found the pro-Hillary Clinton sites on Yahoo and Google much easier than the others, so he has documented that. And now a new one that has come out as well, Nicholas Diakopoulos, he's Greek, but he's a professor at Northwestern University, which again has been looking at these Google searches and Facebook and others. So these are academic studies now coming out documenting what we've known for some time, and that is you have certain gatekeepers. And at least with Google or YouTube, you can sort of identify who the gatekeepers are. The problem with Wikipedia is it's what's called an open source situation. So a lot of the people making the edits, we don't even know who they are. They're probably in their basement in their pajamas and just either monitoring their favorite sites so that you can't make some corrections that need to be made on Wikipedia, or else they're trolls out there looking for sites that they can damage. And so this is the world of information, and this is why I think we need to, once again, pay attention to the issue of liberty.
Right, and diversify our outlets and our search engines. I mean, I wish we could. They'd certainly have a big part of the market, but really, if you even think about Twitter and how many conservative accounts they shut down, or conservative journalists they don't even allow to have Twitter. Or even last week, I went to a conservative website and I was trying to find some information on it, and Google kept sending me a warning that it wasn't a secure website, right. And I got that 5 times before I could get through. You know, those are going to deter people from continuing to seek out truth.
I would think so. Well, again, if you want to know more about religious liberty, we have the link again to firstliberty.org. If you want to know what are my rights if I send my child off to school, what are my rights in school or in business or other things, those pamphlets, I know they're really good because Chelsey wrote them, right?
That's right. They're flawless.
So, again, those are all available at First Liberty as well. You can click on the button there, and it has cases, issues, but click on the one that says resources, and you will find some great resources. And Chelsey wrote those, so we can certainly benefit from the work that you've done there. And, again, if you are concerned about your religious liberty, you can give them a call and find out a little bit more. I would encourage you to pray for some of these cases that we've been talking about, because whether it's the Cambridge school or with Coach Kennedy or whatever it might be, there are just so many cases that you're following right now. And it brings us back to the need for us to also contact our 2 United States senators and say, let's get an up or down vote on all of these nominees. So a lot to talk about today. And Chelsey, thanks for joining us in the morning here on Point of View.
Well, I loved being here. I hope you have a great week.
Yes, we're going to take a break, and for those of you that listen to the program live, we will be on in about 2 hours. So, of course, we will rebroadcast the Monday program on Tuesday, which you'll be able to hear tomorrow. So, again, join us on Point of View, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
From director Kevin Sorbo and executive producer Sean Hannity comes Let There Be Light. Saul Harkins is a man who has turned away from God, but a near-fatal car crash gives him one last chance to renew his life, his family, and his faith. Let There Be Light, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at LetThereBeLightMovie.com.
Christianity is based in history, on evidence, and all truth revealed in God's Word is for our good, not just spiritually, but in every way. Point of View's mission is to restore God's truth in our culture, and to do it effectively, we need you as a partner. Your gift helps inspire people, young and old, from coast to coast to rebuild truth in their communities. Join the Truth Team today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Get off the sidelines. pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have.